So for those of you who are planning on going into practice, either bookkeeping or as an accounting practice, have you ever wondered, should I start from scratch or buy a practice that's already established? So today we're going to talk about the pros and cons of starting all alone from your basement kind of deal versus buying a practice that's already established. So just for the record, I started my practice from my basement all alone as a lone wolf, as many other practitioners have done before. And so over the years, I've come to appreciate the advantages and disadvantages of doing it this way versus people who have started by purchasing a practice. And it's a question that I get asked all the time, and it's a decision that's difficult to make as to whether do I start from scratch or do I buy a practice that's already established. So I thought today I would cover the pros and cons of each part, and then you can make a decision as to which route you want to go. Do you want to go the start from scratch route or go with the purchase of another practice route? So we're going to start with the advantages and disadvantages of starting a practice from scratch, as I did. So one of the advantages of starting from scratch is, of course, you can grow this practice at your own pace. So one of the things that I appreciated is that if you're green and you don't really know what you're doing, well, you're given time to learn as you go, as your practice grows. So it gives you a chance to get some traction, to get comfortable with dealing with clients and so on, because you don't have so much to deal with right off the hop. So I'm finding the learning curve is maybe a bit more comfortable starting from scratch than starting with a purchase of a practice. One of the things that I appreciate about starting my practice from scratch, it allowed me to have more control over the kind of clients I wanted to service, about the team that I would bring on board, and so on and so forth. So that is really kind of cool of starting from scratch, because I'm totally in control about everything that I do in my practice, but more importantly, in charge of the culture. Because if you're going to buy a practice, and this is going to be a con we're going to get more a little bit on, but if you buy a practice, there's probably already a culture that's existent. And therefore, to change that culture is a lot more work than getting it from scratch and you building that culture from the ground up. The disadvantage, of course, of starting from scratch is, well, no revenues. So you will likely have to live off of your savings until you get the practice going. And so depending on how quickly you can build this thing, you might need quite a bit of savings for you to get to a point where you can actually earn a decent living without buying a practice. And that timeline can be fairly long depending on the practitioner. So I've seen some people who will go from 0 to 100 in no time flat, while others, it's a slow grind to get these new clients. So that's something. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the advantages and disadvantages of buying a practice. So needless to say, one of the clear advantages of buying a practice is that you've got instant cash flow, instant revenues. And depending on what you pay for your practice and what your payment schedule is and all of that, you will likely be able to earn a living right off the hop. And I've seen several practitioners who bought a practice, and within days of having bought the practice, they're already earning a decent living. Whereas if I look at the way I starting from scratch, it took me a while to get to a point where I was satisfied with the revenues I was earning. So obviously you can get there quite a bit faster by starting with a practice that's already well established. The other thing that I really like about starting a practice with a base, that is buying a practice, is that I think it's easier to grow a practice that's already existing than starting from scratch. So I look at the pain of bringing my practice from being 0 to say $50,000 of gross revenues. That was really difficult. And I find that with every year that went by, the speed at which I could pick up clients increased. So the speed and the effort and the time and energy required to gain from $0 to $50,000 with a client was extremely hard. But then from 50 to 100, that was quite a bit easier. And then from 100 to 150, a lot easier yet. So once you hit, say, for example, the $1 million kind of business, increasing that $1 million practice to $1,050,000 is a lot easier and comes way more quickly. So the speed at which you can pick up clients just continues to accumulate. So obviously, if you can start with something that's a little bit bigger, it allows you to grow it even faster because it multiplies. So if you have 10 clients and you increase it by 20%, well, all you've done is increase it from 10 to 12, not a big increase. But if you have 100 clients and you increase it by 20%, well, now you've gone from 100 to 120, and those 20 clients is fairly substantial in revenue. Now imagine if you had 1,000 clients and you increase it by 20%. Well, now you just increase your client base by 200 clients. So it is exponential, and it does pick up speed. So that's the advantage of starting off with a good, solid foundation when buying a practice versus starting from scratch. So before I go into the disadvantages of buying a practice, I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe and like this video, and by all means, please provide your thoughts onto what I'm saying with regards to buying or starting from scratch. So now to talk about the disadvantages of being in practice. One of the difficult parts of buying a practice is, of course, putting a price tag on that practice. So unless you have the kind of experience that I do in buying practice, it's difficult to determine the right price for any given practice. So one of the things I would strongly recommend is that you work with people who have already bought a few practices and give you some guidelines on how to negotiate, get the price right, and so on and so forth. And one of the things I would strongly recommend, and I hate being a salesperson here, but I've got a fair amount of experience in that, please don't hesitate to contact me with help on how to purchase a practice and the price that goes along with that. Because the other thing you got to be very careful about and very aware of is the emotion side that will come of that. Because I find a lot of people, especially if they're starting from scratch, they get overly excited about buying a practice. They will pay an outrageous price for a practice that is way above what it's worth. So to have someone from the outside to just calm those emotions down for you to make the right deal for you in purchasing a practice. So don't let your emotions run away on you when making a deal in purchasing a practice. Of course, one of the disadvantages of buying a practice is the quick financial output. You will obviously have to come up with capital and dish it out early on, so you're starting off with debt. So the level of commitment is both an advantage and a disadvantage, because if you buy a practice, now you have no choice but to make it run. So that can be a disadvantage because now you're stuck. And it's a lot easier to change your mind and go back to being an employee or whatever. It's a lot easier to do that if you start from scratch than if you bought a practice. So you got to remember, by buying a practice, your level of commitment, Joes, go way up right off the hop. And it makes it very difficult for you to change your mind. But that could also be an advantage. It's a little bit like burning the boats, right? If you're onshore and you have to fight the war, you're much more likely to succeed if you've burnt the ships and there's no way back than you are if you can't always get back on the ships and run away. So there is a pro and con with regards to level of commitment in buying versus starting a practice from scratch. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. One of the disadvantages starting with a practice that you've already bought is you have to now buy into the culture that's already there, harder to change. But you're also starting at a higher level, meaning that your skills required to run a practice has to go up real fast. So there's no much room for learning as you go when you're buying a practice. So here's what I would strongly recommend. If you are going to buy a practice, there's much less room for error, especially big errors. So this is where having a mentor, it becomes, I think, crucial. I would never recommend a person buy a practice without a mentor. Now, of course you can, and a lot of them have succeeded, but it's a way more difficult route, and I would strongly recommend that the value of a mentor, especially if you're going to start off with a practice that you're buying, is going to be gold. The other thing that I don't like about buying, and I've bought several books of practice, some things that comes along with that are the people. So you might be buying a practice, but you're not too keen on the employees that are there. Well, it makes it difficult because now what do you do with them? Do you fire them? What do you do? And how about the clients? Same thing. You may not be too keen on all of these clients because you're not the one who brought them on board. So there's difficulties in purchasing a practice that comes with the history that comes with that practice that you got to be very aware of and keenly aware of the challenges that come along with that make you feel a bit uncomfortable. So that's about it. Those are just a few of the things. And obviously, I've missed a lot of things. It's way more complicated than that. But I'm hoping that these things will kind of get the mind rolling in the right direction. And again, I really implore you, if you have any doubts as to which is best for you, because it is situational and it is character. But if you're wondering what's right for you, please do not hesitate to call me. And again, don't be afraid of adding your comments below. I will probably reading those comments and responding to them if you don't want to communicate with me directly. And I'd be happy to provide you with a hand in making that decision. And finally, if you're going to start a practice or you're going to buy one, remember, it's important that you work on your practice more than you do in your practice and that you make every minute count.